Lacey and I met back in college, in amateur radio club, of all places. We became best friends first, but I knew within months of meeting her that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with her. About a year ago, she went for a jog one morning before dawn and never came home. Until now. I never stopped searching for her. But, as time passed, I had a harder time continuing to hold on to the hope of finding her alive. Then, out of nowhere, she just showed up a few nights ago. She stood outside our bedroom window, seemingly unbothered by the sheets of rain. She visited again last night. She stood outside my window just like she has every night this week. Her eyes, which were sunken and oddly angled as if they were melting, seemed to stare into nothingness. I am careful not to look at her for too long. My wife's missing persons case is still open, and seeing her now, I doubt it will ever be closed. I wouldn't define her current state as living, but I don't think we'll ever find her body. Would the police even believe me if I told them? The thing that is in part my wife seems to follow a routine. When it comes, it places a hand against the window and taps gently. When I ignore it, it places a second hand, a third, a fourth, all mismatched and in varying states of damage and wear, and taps more frantically. It does this most nights, sometimes while it moans and whispers from some of its many mouths while tongues loll from others. Even though part of me is used to it by now, the sight of it coupled with the sound of those layered voices speaking no language I've ever heard still sends shivers down my spine. If I stare at those layers of flesh dripping with mouths and eyes, for too long at one time, I find myself dazed, drawn in. Something about it, the longer I stare, the more its patchwork of victims and features begin to make sense and even has a sort of beauty. My resistance and logic fade, it feels as if it's welcoming me. The more I look, the stronger my longing is to join them. It would be so easy to take one of its hands and be pulled in, to become a family again and leave the emptiness of my current situation behind. These thoughts seep into my mind during each visit and never leave. Each time, it becomes harder to fight them. The first night it came, the hands at the windows, its grotesque body, not to mention the voices, they terrified me. I mean, what do you do when something like this emerges from the woods and taps on your windows? But from the moment I noticed those sea-green eyes with flecks of gold and the irises staring back at me, I knew it was Lacey, or at least part of it was her. It reached out to me with one of its many hands, and it just felt right. I had opened the window and was halfway through before I just happened to receive a phone call, and my loud and catchy ring-tone freed me from my stupor. I started desperately wondering what she needed to tell me. Did she know how I could help her? Even though it's no longer a requirement to renew your amateur radio license, we had still tried to keep our Morse code knowledge fresh. It was helpful, plus it held a special meaning to us since we had learned together back in college when we first started dating. So, with a renewed sense of purpose I hadn't felt in months, I focused on the tapping of the hands at the window. I listened obsessively and even took notes to make sure I didn't miss any indication that she was still in there trying to send me a message. But, after a while, it became clear that the taps truly were random. The only meaning they carried was that of desperation to get inside. There was no recognition in her half-lidded eyes, and I could only stare for so long before I'd find myself drawn towards the thing, ready to join her. After those first visits, I eventually managed to find some measure of solace in the thought that she was not really there, and that she was truly gone. When I first saw her eyes, I feared that she was in there, a powerless observer trapped somewhere between life and death. If she was truly gone, then I had hoped that she had at least gone as quickly and peacefully as possible when it took her and dragged her into its eternal embrace. She's far from its only victim. It's imposing, taller than I am, and mouths and eyes take up every inch of its mess of dripping human flesh that isn't arms. But Lacey's eyes are always exactly at my own eye level. That must be intentional. Perhaps how it hunts, I'm guessing. It hasn't tried the door since the first night, but I noticed the other morning that there was damage and bite marks in the outer frame of that window. That explains the other noises I had heard while I tried my best to sleep and ignore this thing. It was the sound of dozens of sets of dulled human teeth trying to gnaw their way in. I didn't know who to call for help, and I was preparing to stay with a friend, but then 2 nights ago, the mouths ceased their cryptic whispers and began to scream in unison, a sharp, unearthly sound that caught my attention. That was the first night that she spoke to me. Not through the screams from a stranger's mouth, though. It was her eyes, which were sharp and alert for the first time. She met my gaze and deliberately gave 3 quick, 3 slow, 3 quick blinks. I desperately tried to communicate with her more, but after her message, her eyes became glazed and unfocused. I could tell she was gone again, as if she'd used all the strength she had and was pulled back down and buried within that mass of human suffering. I was forced to look away when I felt the longing to go to the creature creeping in again. It was heartbreaking, realizing that she was in there and conscious somehow. Had she been trapped like this for the past year? Each visit, a few hours before sunrise, it ends its routine by returning to the woods along a path that it has since eked out by pulling its nightmarish body along the ground. I wonder how many other people it visits, where it goes when it's not here. Maybe it collects entire families, beckoning to them with their loved ones' eyes while whispering at them with strangers' mouths. Despite the risks, I had to talk to her again. I needed to know how I could save her, but I hadn't been able to get through to her again after that first night. So, I did something different, something reckless, this morning before dawn. As it went to leave and pull itself back towards the shadowed woods, I allowed it to get some distance and then quietly got out of bed and slipped out the front door. I hoped my plan was enough to protect me from the prolonged eye contact I'd need to make. I leapt off my porch, landing unsteadily on the rocky ground, and I screamed her name. The thing slowly changed course to inch back towards me. Her eyes met mine and seemed to widen in recognition, and then in fear. "How do I save you?" I begged of the thing, my voice strained. In answer, as it approached me in the scant light, it began open and unfurl its fleshy form, revealing rows and rows of long and thin black teeth, a gaping maw in the middle. The human mouth screamed, the eyes widened in sheer terror as its victims were seemingly jolted into awareness. I wondered grimly if they were each recalling the moments of their own demise. Out here, without the walls between us, I could smell the faint stench of decay emanating from it. I could see more details in its cascading folds of flesh, bits of hair, and features that somehow unnerved me further. It had shifted and I could see the features of its mass that it had been dragging along the ground. Some of those eyes were scarred and damaged while others were gone entirely, leaving just blackened holes. Many of those mouths were lipless and just rows of gums and teeth. But they too seemed to be open and screaming. My stomach dropped as I wondered, were they aware, too? This was not something that was meant to be seen in the pale light of the approaching dawn. I was frozen, rooted to the spot, partially in fear at its proximity and appearance, partially because I needed it closer. I needed to see her eyes. I'm not sure if it was me calling out to her, or the thing closing the distance between us that did it, but she was back for just a moment, just long enough. She blinked at me frantically. It continued to approach me. Its arms were spread open as if inviting me into some sick parody of a lover's embrace, welcoming me into 100 sharp and thin teeth and an endless existence in misery. She continued to blink at me frantically, I think to tell me to run, but the world went fuzzy again and I couldn't process what she was saying anymore. I began to move towards it, to her. And then, cutting through the chorus of screams, my phone alarm went off. It was the one with the awful buzzer sound. That, plus the vibrations from my pocket, managed to snap me out of it. I'd made an extremely lucky guess both in that it would work, and that I needed to set it for 5 minutes. My mind once again my own, I turned and sprinted back into the house, choking back a sob as the meaning of her request hit me. It watched me for a while before changing direction to follow its path into the woods. I finally found her. And now, I have to kill her. If you see it outside your window, or in the woods of western Massachusetts, that means I've failed. In that case, do not stare. Do not take its hands. And, if you can, please, please kill it. If I fail, and I join my wife, please end me, end us.